The year is 1587. The air in England is thick with the scent of war and ambition. Queen Elizabeth I is desperate to challenge the Spanish grip on the Americas. Among her most trusted explorers is Sir Walter Raleigh, a man with a vision of a new Virginia. But this story isn't about kings or queens. It's about 115 ordinary souls, men, women and children, who boarded 3 small ships with the hope of a new life. Unlike previous expeditions made solely of soldiers and gold hunters, this group included families. Among them was Eleanor Dare, the daughter of the expedition's leader, John White. She was pregnant, carrying the future of English colonization in her womb. As the white cliffs of Dover faded into the mist, these settlers had no idea they were sailing toward a mystery that would remain unsolved for over 4 centuries. They were headed for Roanoke Island, a small strip of land off the coast of what we now call North Carolina. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, but it was also a place where a previous military outpost had already failed under violent circumstances. The arrival at Roanoke was plagued by bad omens from the start. The ship's pilot, a man named Simon Fernandez, was impatient and refused to take the settlers further north to the Chesapeake Bay as originally planned. He dropped them off at Roanoke and essentially told them to make it work or die. The settlers found the ruins of the previous fort, overgrown with weeds, and the bones of one of the soldiers left behind years earlier. Despite the fear, life had to go on. Just weeks after landing, on August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the New World. Her birth was a symbol of hope, a sign that this wild, untamed land could truly become a home. But that hope was short-lived. The settlers soon realized they were running out of supplies. The local CROATOAN tribe, still angry over previous conflicts with English soldiers, was not willing to help. Realizing that his people would starve before winter ended, John White made a heartbreaking decision. He would sail back to England alone to gather food, tools and reinforcements, leaving his daughter and newborn granddaughter behind. John White promised to be back in 6 to 9 months. But when he reached England, he found a country in total chaos. The Spanish Armada, the greatest naval fleet in the world, was preparing to invade England. Queen Elizabeth ordered that every single English ship be used for the war. White's return to Roanoke was blocked. For 3 agonizing years, John White stood on the shores of England, looking west across the Atlantic. Every night he must have wondered, is Virginia walking yet? Is my daughter Eleanor still alive? Did they survive the winter? He made several attempts to hire privateers to take him back, but sea battles and storms always turned them back. It wasn't until 1590, 3 years after he left, that he finally secured passage on a privateering vessel. As the ship approached the coast of Roanoke, White saw smoke rising from the island. His heart leapt with joy. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. He was sure his family was waiting for him. The landing party reached the shore on August 18, 1590, Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. They blew a trumpet and sang English songs to signal their arrival, but the only response was the sound of the wind through the trees. When they reached the settlement, the sight was chilling. The houses had been taken down. The area was surrounded by a high palisade of tree trunks, like a fort, but there was no one inside. The smoke White had seen earlier was from a brush fire, not a cooking flame. Everything was gone. Then, White found the only clues they would ever get. Carved into a wooden post of the fort was the word CROATOAN. On a nearby tree, the letters CRO were etched into the bark. White had instructed the settlers that if they were forced to leave, they should carve the name of their destination on a post. If they were in danger, they were supposed to carve a Maltese cross above the name. There was no cross. To White, this meant the settlers had moved willingly to CROATOAN Island, now Hatteras Island, where a friendly tribe lived. But before he could sail there to find them, a massive hurricane began to brew. The ship's anchors snapped, the food supplies were ruined, and the captain insisted on returning to England immediately. John White was forced to abandon his search. He died in England a few years later, never knowing the fate of his family. The story of Roanoke didn't end with John White's death. It only grew into a haunting legend. What happened to the 115 people? If they moved to CROATOAN, why were they never found by later explorers? Did they merge with the natives, or were they wiped out by a rival tribe? Some legends say they were captured by a powerful chief named Powhatan, the father of the famous Pocahontas. Others believe they tried to sail back to England in small boats and were lost at sea. But the most fascinating theory is the one that history tried to hide. That the lost colony wasn't lost at all, but rather they became a part of America itself in a way no one expected. After John White was forced to abandon his search in 1590, Roanoke Island fell into a deep, heavy silence. To the world, the 115 settlers had vanished into thin air. But history is rarely that simple. While the English elites in London wrote off the colony as a failure, the wilderness of North Carolina was beginning to whisper a different story. The settlers were gone, but they were not necessarily dead. If you look closely at the maps of the time, the word CROATOAN wasn't just a mystery, it was a destination. The Croatan people were a resilient tribe who lived on the barrier islands. They were known to be friendly to the English. It is highly likely that as the settlers' food ran out and the shadows of starvation grew long, they didn't wait to die. They packed their belongings, dismantled their houses with the skill of English carpenters, and moved. But they didn't just move to another island, they moved into the very bloodline of the American continent. Fast forward nearly 50 years. As new waves of European explorers began to push into the interior of North Carolina and the Appalachian foothills, they started reporting something impossible. Deep in the woods, far from any white settlement, they encountered tribes of Native Americans who didn't look like the others. There are documented accounts from the 1600s and 1700s of native groups with gray and blue eyes. Some had light brown hair and a complexion that burned in the sun rather than bronzing. Most shockingly, these people practiced European-style agriculture. They built wooden homes with floors and second stories, unlike the bark-covered longhouses of their neighbors. When asked where they came from, some of these groups, like the Lumbee tribe, maintained an oral tradition that their ancestors talked in a book and came from across the Great Water. Could the 115 settlers of Roanoke have simply walked into the forest and become the ancestors of a new, mixed-race American identity? For centuries, the integration theory was the only hope for the lost colony. That changed in 1937 when a tourist from California was driving through the swamps of North Carolina and stumbled upon a 21-pound quartz stone. On its surface was a heartbreaking message carved in 16th century style English. It was a letter from Eleanor Dare to her father, John White. The stone claimed that after White left, the settlers suffered miserably. It spoke of sickness and war, and stated that more than half the colony was dead. Most tragically, it claimed that Eleanor's husband and her daughter, Virginia Dare, had been killed by savages. This first stone was found to be geologically consistent with the area, but then, things got strange. Over the next 3 years, more than 40 more stones appeared across Georgia and South Carolina. These Dare stones told a long, epic journey of a dying group of survivors fleeing deeper into the south to escape hostile tribes. While many historians later called the stones a hoax to make money during the Great Depression, modern forensic experts have recently reopened the case. At least the first stone, the Roanoke stone, remains an eerie possibility that Eleanor Dare was trying to leave a trail of breadcrumbs for a father who would never return. While some believe the settlers lived in peace with the Croatans, others point to a darker hidden history. When the famous Jamestown colony was settled in 1607, 20 years after Roanoke, the settlers there asked about their predecessors. Captain John Smith, the leader of Jamestown, claimed he was told a gruesome secret by Chief Powhatan, the father of Pocahontas. Powhatan allegedly admitted that he had ordered the massacre of the Roanoke survivors. He claimed they were living with a tribe called the Chesapeake, and he feared their influence. To prove his point, Powhatan showed Smith several English objects, a brass mortar and pestle, a piece of iron, and even a house built of stone. If this story is true, it means the lost colony wasn't lost at all. They were a political threat that was eliminated just before the next wave of English settlers arrived. However, no mass grave has ever been found, and many believe Powhatan was simply bragging to intimidate the new English arrivals. So where is the truth? Is it in the DNA of the blue-eyed people of the swamps? Is it etched into the quartz of the Dare stones? Or is it buried in the political massacres of the 1600s? The most fascinating part of the Roanoke hidden history is that it challenges the idea of us versus them. The lost colony reminds us that the first Americans didn't always conquer. Sometimes they were absorbed. They didn't always win. Sometimes they just survived. They became a part of the landscape, their English names morphing into native dialects, their golden hair fading into the genetics of a new world. The colony was lost to England, but it was found by America. As we conclude this journey, we realize that Roanoke isn't just a ghost story. It is the birth certificate of a mysterious blended nation. For over 400 years, the story of Roanoke was treated as a ghost story, a legend to be told around campfires. But in the 21st century, the mystery moved out of the history books and into the laboratory. We no longer have to rely on carved stones or the word of a bragging chief. Today, we have the most powerful tool ever created for solving cold cases: the human genome. If the 115 settlers, men like Eleanor Dare and women like Eleanor, truly integrated into the native tribes, they didn't just disappear. They left behind a biological signature. Their DNA would be a hidden code waiting to be decrypted. Scientists and genealogists have now turned their attention to the descendants of the people who lived in those swamps for centuries. They are looking for the English markers that shouldn't be there. Genetic echoes of families from 1587 London, buried deep within the DNA of modern-day North Carolinians. While the geneticists were busy with swabs and test tubes, archaeologists made a breakthrough that changed everything. For years, everyone looked for the colony on Roanoke Island. But a re-examination of John White's 1585 map revealed something hidden. Using modern imaging technology, researchers found a tiny, diamond-shaped patch of paper covering a section of the map. Underneath that patch was a symbol for a fort. This location, now known as Site X, is located 50 miles inland at the head of the Albemarle Sound. When archaeologists began to dig there, they found exactly what they were looking for. They didn't find a mass grave. They found pieces of high-status English pottery, a metal nut from a crossbow, and glass beads used for trade, all dating back to the late 16th century. This suggests that the colony didn't just vanish. They followed a plan. They moved inland to a more protected area, likely splitting into smaller groups to survive. Site X provides the first physical evidence that the settlers were living a life in the American interior long after John White sailed away. The most emotional part of this hidden history lies with the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. For generations, the Lumbee people have fought for federal recognition, maintaining that they are the descendants of the lost colony. While early historians ignored them, the evidence is becoming harder to dismiss. When early settlers first encountered the Lumbee in the 1700s, they found them already speaking English and practicing Christianity. But it was their last names that were the smoking gun. Many Lumbee families carry the surnames of the original 1587 settlers, names like Sampson, Cooper, and Dare. Genetic testing has shown that many members of this tribe possess European mitochondrial DNA that predates the arrival of later waves of settlers. They aren't just a tribe that met the English, they are the living legacy of the English. To the Lumbee, the lost colony was never lost, they were simply family. They took the starving survivors in, shared their food, and over time, the two cultures became one. What of the child? Virginia Dare, the first English girl born in the Americas, became a symbol of the nation. In legends, she is often portrayed as a white doe, a mystical figure that roams the forests of Roanoke. Some stories say she was killed in the Powhatan massacre, while others say she grew up to be a bridge between two worlds, a woman who spoke two languages and lived as a leader among the CROATOAN. While we may never find a headstone with her name on it, her legacy is etched into the American spirit. She represents the moment when the English stopped being invaders and started becoming Americans. If the integration theory is correct, Virginia Dare didn't die a lonely death in a dark forest. She lived, she married into the tribe, and her descendants might be walking among us today. The tragedy of John White was that he was looking for a daughter in an English dress, but she had already become a woman of the New World. The story of Roanoke is the ultimate American myth. It is a story of failure that turned into a story of survival. We spent 400 years asking, where did they go, because we assumed they had to remain English to exist. But Roanoke teaches us that to survive in a new world, you must be willing to change. The 115 settlers weren't swallowed by the earth, they were absorbed by the heart of a continent. They traded their woolen coats for deerskin, their English psalms for native songs, and their isolation for a community. The colony was lost to history, but it was found in the DNA, the legends, and the very soil of North Carolina. As the sun sets over the ruins of the old fort today, we realize that the mystery isn't about death. It's about the birth of a new, blended people. For over 400 years, the world looked at the lost colony as a tragedy of absence, a story defined by what was missing. But as we move into the final layer of this hidden history, we find that Roanoke didn't just survive in the bloodlines of the Lumbee or the soil of Site X. It survived in the very architecture of the American mind. This final chapter isn't just about where they went. It is about how their disappearance shaped the identity of a superpower. In the mid-19th century, as the United States was struggling to define itself before the Civil War, the story of Virginia Dare was resurrected. She wasn't just a missing child anymore, she became a romantic icon. Writers and poets began to weave a new legend, the legend of the White Doe. According to local folklore in the Outer Banks, Virginia Dare did not die in a massacre or fade away in a swamp. Instead, she was transformed by a rejected sorcerer into a white deer. For years, hunters claimed to see a majestic white doe roaming the misty dunes of Roanoke, a creature that could never be caught, carrying the spirit of the first English American. This myth wasn't just a fairy tale. It was a way for a young America to claim that its roots were mystical, ancient, and deeply tied to the land itself. But beyond the folklore lies a more grounded, structural legacy. If we look at the way the settlers of 1587 lived, we see the blueprint for the American frontier spirit. Unlike the soldiers who came before them looking for gold, these 115 people were looking for a home. They were the first to realize that to live in America, you could not simply be an English citizen living abroad. You had to adapt. This adapt or perish mentality became the defining trait of the pioneers who would eventually push all the way to the Pacific. The Roanoke settlers were the first to face the Great American Silence, and their struggle taught future colonies like Jamestown and Plymouth that the wilderness was not a place to be conquered from the outside, but a place to be joined from the within. In 2026, modern technology has allowed us to revisit the CROATOAN post with fresh eyes. Forensic linguists have studied the carvings and the letters left behind by John White, comparing them to the dialects that evolved in the isolated high-tide communities of the Outer Banks. They found something startling. Certain vowel shifts and grammatical structures used by locals today are direct echoes of the Elizabethan English spoken in 1587. For centuries, these people lived in isolation on the barrier islands, preserved like a time capsule. When you hear a traditional Hatteras fisherman speak today, you aren't just hearing a local accent, you are hearing the ghost of the lost colony. The language didn't die, it just moved to the water's edge. The search for Roanoke has also sparked a revolution in citizen science. No longer is this mystery reserved for professors in ivory towers. Thousands of ordinary people are now part of the Lost Colony DNA project. Using commercial ancestry kits, people across the globe are finding small, unexplained percentages of Native American DNA linked specifically to the Algonquian-speaking tribes of North Carolina. At the same time, people of native descent are finding genetic markers that trace back to 16th century Devon and London. These digital threads are weaving a map that shows the settlers didn't move as one large group, but scattered like seeds in the wind. Some went north to the Chesapeake, some went south to the Croatans, and some went west into the deep pine forests. They became the hidden Americans, the people who chose to live outside the gaze of the British Empire. One of the most profound realizations of this hidden history is the role of the women. In the traditional history of the 1500s, women were often invisible. But in Roanoke, women like Eleanor Dare were the anchors. They were the reason the colony dismantled their houses instead of fleeing in a panic. Moving a colony with children and pregnant women requires immense coordination and peace. The fact that the Maltese cross was never carved proves that the women of Roanoke were not victims of a sudden raid. They were the architects of a planned exodus. They chose a future with the native tribes over a certain death behind a wooden fort. They were the first mothers of a blended nation, choosing survival and integration over the rigid pride of an empire. Today, if you visit Roanoke Island, you will find the Lost Colony outdoor drama, the longest-running theatrical performance in America. Every summer, under the stars, the story of the disappearance is told again and again. But the real drama isn't on the stage. It's in the silence of the trees. It's in the quartz stones that may still be buried in the Georgia clay. It's in the Site X pottery that sat in the dirt for 430 years. The mystery of Roanoke is no longer a cold case, because the evidence is everywhere. It is in the faces of the Lumbee people, the strange vowels of the islanders, and the DNA of millions of Americans who have no idea they carry a piece of 1587 in their blood. As we close this final chapter on America's first mystery, we must change our perspective. We shouldn't ask why they were lost. We should ask how they were found by the land itself. Roanoke was not a failure of colonization. It was the first successful instance of Americanization. The 115 settlers didn't vanish into a hole in the earth. They walked into the heart of a continent and became part of its pulse. The empire of the sun may have been the dream of kings, but the colony of the forest was the reality of the people. The word CROATOAN was never a riddle. It was a beckoning. It was a reminder that when the ships don't come back and the food runs out, the only way to survive is to reach out a hand to your neighbor. The lost colony is lost no more. They are us. They are the spirit that refuses to give up, the voice that adapts to the wind, and the blood that connects the old world to the new. The mystery is solved not by finding a grave, but by recognizing a legacy that is still very much alive.